Hello and welcome to today's webinar brought to you by Lightspeed. I'm Tyler Kern, and today you'll hear from 3 experts who are discussing understanding and overcoming listening challenges when schools reopen. Dr. Flexer is a distinguished professor emeritus of audiology at the University of Akron. She's an international lecturer in pediatric and educational audiology and author of more than 155 publications, including 17 books. For her research and advocacy for children with hearing loss, Dr. Flexer has received 5 prestigious awards. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Carol Flexer, who'll be speaking on acoustic accessibility in our new world.
Hello, thank you for joining the conversation about acoustic accessibility in our new world, why listening is foundational to learning, and why understanding and overcoming listening challenges when schools reopen is so critical. So, what is the problem? Poor or even average room acoustics can negatively impact audibility. And not only acoustics, what about masks? Reduced speech audibility can decrease speech perception and understanding. And when there's a decrease in understanding, the child has to work much harder, which uses up cognitive energy and thinking capacity that ought to be used for processing information and not just receiving the information. Lack of clear, easy brain access, because of course we hear with the brain, to information, it drains a child's reserves and as a result, dilutes communication and learning. And for children, the end result is a high risk for a slower pace of learning. This is a basic information transformation model. Transfer model. How does information get from the brain of the speaker, what's in the speaker's mind, through the environment to the mind and brain of the listener? So for the speaker to be effective, the speaker has to use adequate speech intensity, be familiar with the language, and speak clearly. The acoustic environment, the medium, the classroom, needs to be available for the transmission of that signal. Any noise, any echoes or reverberation can smear the transmission. And what about the encoding capacity, the function of the individual's ear itself? And then we get to the listener's brain for processing, which depends on the child's language and speech competency and their cognitive processing capacity. So the point of information transfer is that any of these variables can influence the adequacy of communication between talker and listener in all sorts of ways. And the acoustic characteristics of the room will determine the integrity, the sufficiency of the information. See, we're talking about information and knowledge getting to that child. To create neural pathways. See, all learning results in alteration of neural networks in the brain. But in order for that brain to be impacted, information has to actually get there. And for children, research has demonstrated that inappropriate levels of noise or reverberation, which is an echo or a bounce, can compromise not only speech perception, but because we're talking about learning, also can negatively impact reading, spelling, behavior, attention, concentration, even for children who are developing typically and who have full cognitive capacity. And for children who have any challenges, having this information transfer disrupted can be very compromising for their overall development. Hearing and listening, are they the same? Hearing is actually, or we can talk about hearing, as acoustic access to the brain perception of auditory information. You see, the ear is the doorway to the brain for auditory knowledge, auditory information, like the eye is the doorway to the brain for visual information, the nose for olfactory. See, all of our sensory organs are simply doorways, or should I say in a very complex way, doorways for the management of different types of environmental information. But that information has to get through those sensory structures and into the brain. So hearing can be acoustic access to the brain. Listening, on the other hand, is attending to those acoustic events, to that auditory knowledge intentionally. Now, neurologically, what listening is activation, not volitionally, but through attention, of the prefrontal cortex, which directs the child's cognitive energy to process auditory information. The intent of listening really is, hey, pay attention to this auditory knowledge. The thing is, hearing, that is the actual acoustic data, information, must be made available to the brain before the child can learn to pay attention to information. So we have to know and manage that hearing thing, which is that whole information transfer model, before we can promote and teach that listening thing. Now, there's a science to describe these concepts using extrinsic and intrinsic redundancy as descriptors. James Jerger, who was foundational in audiology, years ago used extrinsic and intrinsic to describe a processing paradigm. Extrinsic redundancy refers to the integrity of information from outside the person, that bottom-up sensory input of information from the environment. Intrinsic redundancy refers to the cognitive capacity, the internal knowledge, attention in the brain, in the child's brain. That's top-down processing. Now, there's an inverse relationship between the two. The weaker the intrinsic or brain development, the clearer, the more obvious that extrinsic signal has to be, because children don't have the top-down capacity of adults. We're growing that top-down capacity. So how do we improve that extrinsic, that sensory information auditorily to help grow that child's cognitive auditory capacity? Well, there's two ways: the way we use our voice and the use of a microphone. Now, voice. Most adults speak faster than most children can process. Children can process about 124 words a minute, but most adults speak faster than 200 words a minute. Slow down. Pause. Think of Mr. Rogers. You can Google Mr. Rogers if you don't know or maybe have forgotten what he sounds like and why he was so impactful in his instruction. He had a wonderful use of his voice, and he used clear speech, full sentences, appropriate grammar, clearly pronouncing all words but not exaggerating. The speaker's use of clear speech can improve the speech perception of the listener by up to 40%. Slow down. Pause. Give the child time to think. Use clear speech and use a remote microphone. Remote microphone means that the mic is close to the sound source. There'll be more about this in the webinar later on. Now, the following populations must have a better extrinsic, better sensory information, because our job is to grow their brain, to create, to develop their intrinsic capacity. Who needs greater extrinsic, clearer sensory input data? All children, because their intrinsic capacity is more immature. They're little. They don't have the language. They don't have the knowledge. They don't have decades of life experience. So we need to make sure their brain receives high integrity information. And there are children who have any sort of challenge who must have greater extrinsic, greater bottom-up, greater sensory clarity. Children with any type and degree of hearing issue, auditory processing, learning, attention, behavior, developmental, visual. Children whose first language, their home language, is not the language of instruction. And how about children who need to catch up on their learning? Do we know children like this? Also, there's a very important issue and distinction of audibility and intelligibility. In this regard, audibility means that the speech is heard, but not heard clearly enough to distinguish specific speech sounds. Now, speech powerfully is low frequency dominant. 90% of the energy of speech is in the low frequencies, 250 and 500 hertz. 250 hertz is roughly middle C on the piano. 90% of the energy of speech is at 250 and 500 hertz, but ironically, only 10% of the clarity. Intelligibility, used in this regard, means that the listener can distinguish all of the phonemic or speech sound elements. Intelligibility in English is carried by consonant sounds. You know, S, T, TH, C, all of those sounds. And consonant sounds have 90% of the intelligibility, but only 10% of the power. They are such weak sounds. So for example, to receive speech intelligibly, the child must be able to hear as different words: walk, walked, walks, walking, walker. If the child hears these words all as walk, 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 they're audible, right? Loud enough, but not intelligible. Have to hear those weak, delicate, high-frequency sounds. So speech intelligibility depends on the level of the talker's voice, the distance between talker and listener. How's the child's hearing? Any ear infections? Any earwax? And how about any intervening objects like masks or face shields? Now, about the level of talker's voice, please don't think I'm saying that you need to talk very loudly or yell, because when we speak loudly, really what we're emphasizing are vowels. Guess that's 90% of the power, but vowels have only 10% of the clarity. That's why we definitely need microphones, so we can use a very average and a normal and an inflected tone of voice, and the microphone amplifies these delicate high frequencies and distributes that auditory information clearly around the room to the brains of every child in that room. So please, let's remember, hearing, learning occurs in the brain. Auditory information, knowledge has to actually get to the brain, that's hearing, in order for learning to occur and neural pathways to be developed. And the child has to actually pay attention to that auditory information. Lack of clear, easy auditory brain access to instructional and social information drains a child's cognitive reserves, dilutes learning and literacy. So we have to increase the integrity of the extrinsic signal, increase the intelligibility of sensory auditory input. Thank you for listening. Let's please make sure that our children can.